Last weekend, I stopped by an open house in a quiet, mid-range suburb. You know, the kind of place that used to be the default setting for the American dream.
Uh-huh.
And standing in the driveway was this young couple. They were the picture of nervous optimism.
I can picture it.
Holding hands, whispering about where a crib might fit in the second bedroom. Looking at the patchy lawn like it was the Garden of Eden.
Right.
You could practically see them mentally calculating their mortgage payments, figuring out how many ramen dinners it would take to afford the down payment.
The whole 9 yards.
So they finally worked up the courage to approach the realtor, a woman who looked bored before the day had even started. They asked about putting in an offer, maybe a few thousand over, asking just to be safe.
Yeah.
And the realtor, she didn't even look up from her iPad. She just gave this short, tired laugh. Don't bother, she told them. The house was sold an hour ago.
An hour ago?
Yeah. The couple looked so confused. The guy said, but the open house just started. Who bought it? The family in the BMW.
Let me guess.
No, she said, finally making eye contact, and her look was almost pitying. It wasn't a family. It was an LLC based in Delaware. All cash, 20% over asking, inspection waived. They bought this one and the 3 blocks over. They aren't moving in, they're turning it into a rental portfolio.
A portfolio, not a home.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And watching that couple walk back to their car, shoulders slumped. The reality of the situation hit me. This wasn't just a tough market. This was a historical echo. I realized I wasn't watching a real estate transaction. I was watching the modern resurrection of the Roman latifundia. That LLC wasn't buying a home, it was enclosing the commons.
That is a tremendously powerful observation.
We look at history books and wonder how empires like Rome or France collapsed, assuming it was some grand, dramatic war. But studying on that sidewalk, I realized the end usually looks exactly like this. A spreadsheet swallowing a neighborhood, one cash offer at a time.
And it cuts straight to the core of what we're talking about today, long-term governance stability. When you strip away all the other details, the specific emperors or the weapons, what you're left with is a structural pattern.
A pattern of collapse.
Yes. The failure to manage fundamental resources, like land, leads to a terminal concentration of wealth. And that, in turn, poisons the entire political system.
So today we're doing a deep dive into that very problem.
We're looking at how a major modern global power, China, has strategically, and I mean very structurally, evolved its land policy specifically to prevent this imperial fate.
So we're investigating the actual policy frameworks.
Exactly. The framework's designed to ensure land remains fundamentally a collective resource, a tool for national development and social welfare, rather than just a purely tradable, speculative commodity.
The mission is clear then. We're exploring how an entire system can be strategically designed to resist that historical trajectory where land concentration just inevitably leads to systemic collapse.
We need to look at the architectural decisions, the ones made by drawing on centuries, even millennia, of historical lessons to create a structural defense against social decay.
Okay, so let's establish the stakes globally. Before we get into the modern solutions, we really need to internalize why land ownership concentration isn't just an economic issue.
Right. It's a political and social destabilizer.
It guarantees civil strife or, a kind of slow internal decay. Why does history teach us this lesson so consistently?
History offers an undeniable, almost mathematical precision on this point. Land concentration is, it's consistently observed right before political instability really sets in.
It's like a leading indicator.
It's a core vulnerability for any large society, whether it's agrarian or rapidly industrializing. When the foundational means of production, the land, is held by an infinitesimally small percentage of the population, the majority simply ceases to have a stake in the system's stability.
Let's start with the classic example then,
Okay.
the Roman Empire. We all talk about the decline, but what was the specific mechanism? How did the latifundia actually destroy the social contract?
And the latifundia were these vast agricultural estates, and they were often acquired through aggressive accumulation fueled by military conquest and debt.
So it wasn't a free market in the way we think of it.
Not at all. Rome's strength was its citizen soldier, the yeoman farmer who owned his small plot of land and was loyal to the Republic because he had a home, a farm to return to.
A stake in the game.
Precisely. As the latifundia expanded, often using enslaved labor, they could produce goods cheaper. They could acquire adjacent lands from smaller farmers who were, away fighting wars for years on end, or who simply succumbed to debt after one bad harvest.
The legal and economic mechanism was simple then.
Deceptively simple. Squeeze out the small owner. But the result was catastrophic political decay.
Because these dispossessed farmers, where did they go?
They flooded the cities, they became the landless proletarians, they had no economic function, and critically, they had no loyalty to a state that had just stood by and allowed them to be dispossessed.
So the state basically destroyed its own recruiting base.
It destroyed its own foundational military and social class. The state, realizing this, was then forced to implement bread and circuses.
Which we think of as entertainment, but it was much more.
Oh, it was a massive, ongoing, and economically ruinous policy. It was state-sponsored distraction and minimal sustenance just to maintain temporary control over a population with absolutely nothing left to lose.
So it wasn't charity.
It was a bribe to prevent the structural revolt that was the inevitable consequence of that land concentration.
So the supposed economic efficiency of the latifundia was completely erased by the political cost of supporting a massive, dispossessed urban underclass.
Exactly. And this failure pattern, it just repeats itself centuries later.
Right. Let's look at Tsarist Russia.
The entire structure of the empire rested on the misery of serfdom. And even after emancipation, you had an exploitative landlord class that maintained control over these vast tracts of arable land.
So the poverty wasn't a bug, it was a feature.
It was a direct feature of a concentrated land ownership system. So when the Bolsheviks finally mobilized the masses, their famous slogan, peace, land, and bread, it wasn't abstract.
It was direct.
It directly addressed the three most acute crises. The promise of land wasn't sophisticated Marxist theory for most people. It was the simple, practical remedy for the structural injustice that had starved and dispossessed the majority for generations.
And we see this even in empires that were, by all accounts, incredibly wealthy.
Absolutely. Think about Imperial Spain at its height. It controlled vast global resources, right? Gold from the Americas. But its domestic economy was perpetually crippled.
Why?
By the dominance of latifundios owned by the nobility and the church. And these estates were often managed incredibly inefficiently. They prioritized aristocratic prestige over productive agriculture.
So they had the land, but not the output.
Precisely. Spain, a country sitting on enormous amounts of arable land, paradoxically became dependent on imported grain.
That's unbelievable.
That concentration of land and the lack of reinvestment led to persistent poverty, constant revolts, and an internal sclerosis that preceded its long, slow imperial decline. The wealth was extracted, but it was never put back into the productive capacity of the nation itself.
And I think the most direct, almost visceral link between land and freedom is probably the Mexican Revolution. The goal there was explicitly framed as a reconquest of lost assets.
Exactly right. Porfirian Mexico saw the hacienda system concentrate ownership to such a radical extreme that it basically created a powder keg. Small communal plots, the ejidos, were systematically absorbed into these vast private estates.
So when Emiliano Zapata raised his banner,
the rallying cry, Tierra y Libertad, land and freedom, was the foundational ideology.
It wasn't just a slogan.
It was the whole point. It demonstrated that in societies built on agriculture, political freedom is meaningless without economic independence, and that independence requires land ownership or, at the very, very minimum, secure access to it. Freedom without land is simply a different form of servitude.
So the universal lesson for any successful long-term governance strategy is clear.
It's crystal clear. Waiting until land concentration creates mass misery guarantees that your only available reforms will be bad, worse, or revolutionary. Stable societies are built on broadly distributed access to foundational resources.
And that brings us to the crucial pivot point for our deep dives today. Ancient Chinese dynasties recognized this inherent political danger.
They absolutely did.
Which led to proactive reforms, like the Tang dynasty's land equalization policy, to maintain the stability of the tax base and the social order. So the question is, how does modern China apply these historical lessons structurally?
Right. Not just through one-off reforms, but through its fundamental legal and philosophical architecture to preempt that imperial fate.
So let's get into that architecture. The current system is explicitly designed as a long-term strategic defense mechanism against this historical trap.
It is. It operates on a core philosophical and legal principle. Land is fundamentally a national asset, not a private commodity. Its use must serve the collective good and ensure long-term stability.
And this philosophy is embodied in something you call the dual-track system.
The dual-track system, yes. Yeah.
Let's break that down, because for many of us who are used to purely private property models, the distinction between use rights, contractual rights, and ownership is, well, it's crucial here. How is this legally manifested across the urban-rural divide?
Structurally, the system divides land into two main categories based on ownership and function. And this separation is the strategic defense against mass land dispossession.
Okay, so track one.
On the rural track, land remains under collective ownership. This means it belongs to the village or the township collective, not the state directly, and not private individuals.
But families can still farm it.
Yes. Rural households hold contractual use rights to specific plots, both farmland and residential land, which are called homesteads. The farmer doesn't own the land outright in the Western sense, but their rights to use it and benefit from it are secure and, increasingly, very long-term.
And critically, you said the transfer of these homesteads is restricted.
That's right. The transfer is currently confined within the collective. This restriction is often misunderstood externally, but it is the absolute key structural barrier.
That restriction seems to be the linchpin of what you call the return option. Can you elaborate on the kind of security that provides?
The restriction against permanent free market sales of rural land, especially those residential homesteads, is the ultimate fail-safe against the latifundia effect.
How so? Give us an example.
Let's imagine a migrant worker, someone who's working in a factory in a huge city far from their ancestral village. If they lose their job, or if a severe economic downturn hits, or if their family back home needs critical care they can't afford in the city,
They have a fallback.
they have a secure floor to fall back on. That contractual right ensures they cannot permanently dispossess themselves of their core asset, even under extreme duress, by selling their land for quick cash to some wealthy corporation from the city.
So it's a form of social insurance baked into the property system itself.
It is the ultimate social welfare tool. It means that that worker, even if they're unemployed in the city, does not become a desperate landless proletarian like in ancient Rome. They maintain a productive asset base and a physical home to return to, which provides subsistence agriculture capacity and, just as importantly, ensures political stability by anchoring the population.
That completely reframes the restriction. It's not about inhibiting economic mobility.
No.
It's about eliminating the possibility of total destitution and the political instability that comes with it. But surely maintaining this restriction has a cost. Isn't the land used inefficiently if people can't sell it to someone who might be more productive with it?
And that is the central tension of the entire system. It is a deliberate political choice.
Stability over efficiency.
Yes, there are absolutely arguments for economic inefficiency due to the immobility of capital and land, but the government's model intentionally prioritizes long-term stability over short-term economic optimization.
So the planners are making a trade-off.
They are willing to accept a degree of inefficiency to structurally prevent the creation of a massive, politically alienated and landless underclass. In their policy view, the economic cost of managing a landless, revolting population, think of the bread and circuses of Rome, vastly outweighs the current cost of these market restrictions.
Okay, let's shift to the urban track. If the rural land is collectively owned, the urban land is state-owned, and it's allocated primarily via land concession. What is the planner's mandate in managing this massive state-owned urban asset base?
The urban system is driven by a leasehold model. The state owns the land and then allocates usage rights, often for 70-year leases, to developers.
Which generates incredible revenue.
Astronomical revenue. It's the primary engine of urbanization. But the planner's mandate is to balance this revenue maximization with the political directive to ensure the city remains socially viable, a living organism.
What does that mean in practice?
It involves reserving a significant percentage of prime real estate for subsidized housing, for low-cost rentals, and for public infrastructure. Even if selling that same piece of land to a luxury commercial developer would bring in vastly more revenue immediately.
So the state acts as the ultimate landlord.
The ultimate landlord with a, you might say, a moral obligation to ensure the tenants, the city's essential workforce, its teachers, nurses, service workers, are not completely priced out.
Because if they are,
the system breaks down, socially and economically. The policy, therefore, dictates that land allocation must be a tool for collective welfare and stability, resisting the temptation to become a pure revenue machine.
So in essence, the dual-track system is this highly sophisticated structural policy. It's aimed at eliminating the historical condition that precipitates imperial decay.
That's right. Using collective land rights as a permanent social safety net and using state ownership in cities to manage equitable access.
Okay, the system sounds very robust in principle. But China's urbanization drive has been, historically unparalleled in its speed and scale.
Unprecedented.
This must put extraordinary pressure on that strategic framework. particularly because local governments rely so heavily on that land concession revenue to fund their rapid expansion.
It does. The pressure is immense.
So what does the execution of this land conversion process actually look like on the ground? And where do the inequalities start to originate?
Well, the sheer scale of the land transfer is just breathtaking. Over a recent 6-year period, just from 2005 to 2011, approximately 10,200 square kilometers of rural land were formally expropriated and converted for urban construction use.
10,000 square kilometers, that's hard to even visualize.
It's an area roughly the size of Lebanon, converted for urbanization in just over half a decade. And 90% of the new urban construction land came from converting that rural collective land to state ownership.
That must have created a massive windfall for local governments.
It did. It fueled their fiscal reliance on land concession revenue, which just skyrocketed. It went from RMB 542 billion in 2004 to RMB 3.2 trillion by 2012. Land sales became the primary engine funding everything: municipal expansion, infrastructure, services.
So how do local governments strategically manage this massive revenue stream? They must have to balance growth with income.
They employ a differentiated allocation strategy. They essentially separate the land market based on its intended use.
Okay, so industrial land versus residential.
Exactly. For industrial land, the goal is job creation and attracting investment. So they often allocate this land directly and at heavily subsidized below market prices. This prioritizes rapid manufacturing growth.
And for commercial and residential?
That's where they maximize income. They employ competitive allocation procedures like public auctions. This is what generates the bulk of the revenue. It's why commercial land prices rose over 300% and residential land prices shot up over 500% in major cities in the 2000s.
So the government is capitalizing on its monopoly ownership of urban land to fund the whole process.
That's the mechanism. But it's a mechanism that inevitably results in surging property prices, and it exacerbates urban inequality.
And if that system is generating trillions of RMB, where does the unequal distribution start to creep in? How does that manifest as social strain?
The strain comes from the disproportionate allocation of the profits. Despite the land originating from these rural collectives, the vast majority of the profits, and conservative estimates suggest 60 to 70%, are channeled directly into urban infrastructure, subsidized housing programs for existing urban residents, and the maintenance of land reserves.
So not back to the rural areas it came from.
Only a smaller, often insufficient share is directed back to rural development or to compensation for the farmers who lost their land in the first place. This systemic urban bias in the fiscal distribution creates an immediate and persistent driver of rural-urban inequality.
And this inequality is then compounded by the migration obstacle we touched on earlier, the fear of losing that rural safety net. How does the hukou system reinforce this problem? How does it create this incomplete integration for migrant workers?
The hukou, the household registration system, is the mechanism that determines where an individual is entitled to public services.
Healthcare, education.
All of it. If a migrant worker obtains an urban hukou, they gain access to all those benefits. But historically, this could require them to relinquish their contractual rights to farmland and their residential land back in their home village.
So it's a huge gamble.
For many, it's a gamble they simply cannot afford to take. Why? Because the secure, indefinite rights to the rural homestead and farmland are far more reliable than the volatile nature of urban employment and the staggering cost of urban living.
So they hedge their bets.
They hedge against urban failure by remaining structurally tied to the rural collective. And this leads to the phenomenon of incomplete urban integration. You have 280 million plus people who migrate for work but remain tied to the countryside, often leaving their children and elderly parents behind.
And this structural barrier, combined with the high cost of formal urban housing driven by those land auctions, it naturally leads to a spontaneous, if informal, solution.
The emergence of urban villages.
Right.
Yes, the urban villages are the market's unintended but absolutely necessary corrective mechanism. They are informal settlements situated on residual collective rural construction land, usually on the urban periphery.
And they house millions of people.
Since the formal housing market prices out 80 to 100 million migrant workers, these rural collectives, using their remaining land, often develop what's called small property rights housing, either illegally or semi-legally.
So they're filling a massive gap in the market.
They fulfill a crucial social and economic function. They provide essential low-cost housing for the floating migrant population, and at the same time, they serve as an important offsetting income source for the dispossessed farmers who lost their farmland but still control the residential land rights. The local collectives become the developers in this massive gray housing market.
That's fascinating. So the very system designed to create long-term stability, the collective land ownership, ends up creating a formal financial engine, the land sales, that generates wealth, but also social exclusion.
And that exclusion is then compensated for by an informal housing market, the urban villages, operating on the periphery of that very system.
It perfectly illustrates the tension between rapid economic development and the political mandate for inclusion.
It really does. And it highlights the need for continuous policy evolution. The tension between maximizing urbanization revenue and ensuring equitable benefit distribution requires constant policy calibration. While the collective ownership provides the safety net, the implementation has been uneven, which necessitates the deep reforms that are now on the blueprint.
Okay, so recognizing these shortcomings, the uneven profit distribution, the partial integration, the next strategic phase involves institutionalizing deeper policy reforms.
That's right.
The goal, it seems, is to make the land system more efficient, more transparent, and more equitable while solidifying its role as a collective resource. What does this reform blueprint look like in practice, particularly when we focus on procedural fairness?
The reform blueprint is very comprehensive. It focuses on three main areas: tightening up the land-taking process itself, integrating the fractured urban and rural markets, and fundamentally reforming local government finance.
What's the overarching political goal?
The political goal is to stabilize the system for the next generation of urbanization by turning farmers into genuine shareholders in the development process, rather than just displaced subjects.
Okay, let's start with the first part, reforming expropriation and compensation.
The first step is to address the conversion process itself. Historically, local governments have sometimes used public purpose as a sort of catch-all justification for land expropriation, even when the land was clearly intended for profitable commercial development.
So the reform tightens that definition.
Exactly. The reform aims to amend land laws to clarify and strictly define public purpose. This legal clarification restricts those land-taking practices and ensures that compulsory acquisition is only used when genuinely necessary for public infrastructure, not for general commercial profit.
Oh, that seems like a powerful check on local government overreach. But the biggest point of contention, I imagine, is usually the compensation.
Always.
The current cap you mentioned, based on agricultural output, sounds hopelessly low compared to the land's actual development value.
It is, and this is the single biggest policy pivot in this entire reform area. Compensation for land conversion, especially for commercial non-public interest purposes, must be dramatically increased.
So away from the old cap.
The old cap, often just 30 times the annual agricultural output, is a minimal subsistence level rate. It completely ignores the massive wealth generated by converting that farmland into, say, a residential skyscraper.
So what's the new standard?
The reform mandates that compensation for commercial land conversion should be raised up to the land's actual commercial or market value. This is a radical change.
It sounds like it.
For a farmer who might have received, say, RMB 100,000 for a plot under the old system, moving to market value could mean receiving millions. It ensures they receive a fair share of the development value their land unlocked. The transition is complex, but it's politically necessary for fairness.
And to move away from these top-down administrative decisions, how are procedural rights being strengthened to empower the farmer in this process?
Procedural fairness is absolutely paramount to ensuring the legitimacy of the whole system. New frameworks establish mandatory procedural rights for farmers.
Such as?
This includes the explicit right to receive notice before the approval of any expropriation plan and the right to participate through mandatory public hearings.
And this isn't just bureaucratic window dressing.
Not at all. It fundamentally shifts the power dynamic. By requiring public participation and negotiation, farmers are legally empowered to scrutinize the purpose of the land taking and to negotiate compensation packages transparently.
I imagine that makes the process more acceptable, even if it's still disruptive.
International experience shows that robust procedural rights significantly enhance the political acceptability of compulsory land acquisition. The affected individuals feel heard and justly compensated.
Okay, let's move to the second pillar. Integrating the rural and urban land markets. We've established that the permanent sale of rural land is restricted to maintain that social safety net.
Correct.
But that same restriction can impede economic efficiency and asset mobilization. So how does the reform plan balance maintaining the security of that safety net while also integrating the markets for more efficient allocation?
The initial step is to strengthen the tenure security held by the rural collectives and households themselves. This is being achieved through property rights confirmation and land titling for all rural land.
So formalizing what already exists.
And clarifying it. Crucially, the reform explicitly clarifies that contractual rights to farmland are indefinite, and that ownership rests firmly with the collective members, not with some administrative entity that could unilaterally manage or sell those assets. This, in itself, increases the value of the farmer's land rights.
But the real innovation, you said, comes from institutionalizing successful local pilot programs.
Yes, programs that allow collective land assets to enter the market without dissolving the collective ownership structure itself.
Let's look closely at those. I know two primary models have been influential, Chengdu and Chongqing. What distinguishes their approaches to integration?
They represent two different strategic approaches to market integration. Both are aimed at maximizing the collective benefit while maintaining security.
Let's start with Chengdu.
The Chengdu model focuses on granting collective land equal rights to state-owned land if it's designated for commercial purposes, so non-public use.
An equal footing.
Essentially. The Chengdu approach advocates for amending the national land management law to create a single integrated urban-rural market for this commercial land. Under this model, land for genuine public interest would still be expropriated with strict rules and market compensation, but all other collective construction land, like the land used for those urban villages, would be brought into the market system following market principles.
So it elevates collective land use rights to near parity with state land leaseholds, at least for commercial ventures.
That's a good way to put it.
And what about the Chongqing model?
Chongqing takes a slightly different, more regulated path. It's centered more on asset mobility. They developed a very sophisticated rural land exchange.
An exchange, like a stock market for land rights.
In a way, this exchange facilitates the voluntary, permanent exit of migrating farmers. If our migrant worker, Chen, decides he wants to permanently integrate into the city, the exchange provides a transparent, market-based mechanism for him to voluntarily transfer his fragmented rural construction land rights.
And what happens to that land?
The collective pool of land is then consolidated and allocated through the exchange to the urban land market. This promotes efficient use while systematically ensuring fair benefit sharing for Chen and his collective members.
So, to simplify, Chengdu is focused on integrating the commercial use rights of land that's already in or near urban areas.
Yes.
While Chongqing is focused on creating a regulated, voluntary pathway for migrating individuals to convert their rural land assets into capital, thereby dissolving their personal need for that safety net.
Exactly. Both strategies aim to unleash market efficiency and allow farmers to realize the economic value of their collective assets. They just do so through different regulatory mechanisms.
But the common denominator is reinforcing the property rights of the collective members.
Absolutely. Ensuring that they, not just local administrators, benefit directly and transparently from the conversion of their collective assets.
And this brings us to what sounds like the most difficult hurdle in the long-term strategic plan: local government finance.
It's the linchpin of the entire reform.
If the reliance on this volatile land concession revenue is supposed to taper off, either because urbanization slows or because these reforms reduce the profit margins on land conversion, a stable, sustainable replacement source of revenue is essential.
It's critical.
What is the centerpiece of this necessary fiscal overhaul?
The core solution is the strategic introduction of a municipality-wide annual property tax system.
A property tax?
Yes. Currently, local governments rely heavily on one-time revenue from land sales. This leads to boom-bust cycles and encourages very short-term thinking. A stable annual property tax is necessary to provide a predictable, sustainable local revenue foundation.
Why is this reform so difficult to implement, and what specific benefits is the government trying to achieve beyond just simple revenue stabilization?
Well, it's politically difficult because it shifts taxation from a transaction event, the land sale, to a wealth-holding event owning property, and that naturally faces significant political resistance.
Of course.
However, the benefits are multifaceted. First, it aligns local government revenue with service quality. If a local government improves schools or infrastructure, property values rise, and so does their property tax revenue. It creates a virtuous feedback loop.
That makes sense.
Second, and this is critical, it acts as a tax on wealth holdings and on speculation. By strategically targeting taxes on empty apartments and unused land held by developers, it encourages the efficient use of property and discourages the speculative hoarding of assets, which helps stabilize housing prices over time.
What are the practical, the technical challenges in implementing a nationwide property tax system in this context? It must be enormous.
The technical complexity is enormous. Unlike developed economies with centuries of property records, China faces challenges in three main areas: valuation, registration, and enforcement.
So just figuring out what a property is worth uniformly.
Exactly. There's a need to establish a uniform, transparent, and fair property valuation methodology across hundreds of different municipalities. Furthermore, the lack of a fully comprehensive and transparent property registry complicates administration and enforcement.
So it's a huge data and infrastructure project.
It's a multi-year project requiring significant technological and political investment to design a system that is both equitable and resistant to corruption. But it is indispensable for ensuring the transition away from land-based finance is stable.
And what other governance reforms have to accompany the property tax to complete this fiscal transition?
The local government structure itself needs greater fiscal autonomy, but with higher accountability.
What does that look like?
It includes granting local governments more control over levying taxes, not just waiting for central approval, and crucially, forcing them to move their borrowing practices on budget.
The off-budget debt problem.
Historically, massive local government debt was accumulated through these complex off-budget vehicles related to land financing. Introducing rigorous regulatory and fiscal rules alongside the property tax hardens the local budget constraint and forces accountability for debt sustainability.
It sounds like a complete rewiring of local finance.
It is. And furthermore, there's a strategic need to centralize functions that have strong externalities, like national social security and pensions. By having the central government take responsibility for these massive liabilities, local governments are relieved of crippling financial burdens.
Which makes the shift away from land revenue much more feasible.
Exactly. It enables them to focus their new property tax revenue on local public services like education and infrastructure. This comprehensive overhaul is a strategic necessity for mobilizing the resources required for truly inclusive and sustainable urbanization. So when we really examine the strategic focus of all these policy evolutions, it's clear that the aim is nothing less than institutionalizing defenses against the historical causes of imperial collapse.
Specifically, land concentration and the massive inequality that results from it.
Precisely. By treating land not as a simple commodity, but as a primary tool of state policy, a structural safety net, and a collective resource, the goal is to maintain stability throughout these unprecedented economic and demographic shifts.
This sustained strategic evolution, it really demonstrates the immense scope of the endeavor. You're managing massive growth, integrating hundreds of millions of people into cities.
And at the same time, you're institutionalizing fairness, transparency, and market efficiency, all while protecting the foundational rights of the rural population.
The success of this policy evolution, then, really determines whether a nation can successfully navigate this highly precarious balance.
And avoid the imperial fate that history has written so consistently into the end of large, concentrated wealth structures.
It's a grand design.
It is a grand design, aimed at stability, resilience, and avoiding the structural flaws that ended nearly every great empire before it.